My grandfather was a Holocaust survivor, and for decades he never talked about his past. I was determined to get my Saba to talk, so I took a week off to interview him. On the second day, he finally opened up and told me all about his life before, during, and after what he called his 5-year European tour of Nazi concentration camps. After the Holocaust, my Saba joined the struggle to create a Jewish state in Palestine. But when he arrived in the Negev desert, he quickly learned that his platoon had only a few old rifles. He thought he was going to die there. Then one day, weapons arrived like manna from the heavens. My Saba held his rifle against the sun, and when he looked closely, he couldn't believe his eyes. Right there, on the metal, was the German eagle. My Saba looked at me and asked, "Boaz, do you know how he got these Nazi weapons?" I had no idea, so I embarked on a journey of discovery. What I learned was that these weapons were brought in by a group of Jewish and non-Jewish Americans led by an aviator named Adolf Schwimmer. They risked their lives and freedom to carry out a secret, illegal, and complex operation. This operation was so secret that it has remained absent from history books, even in America and Israel. Here is the story of the aviators who put everything on the line to give a newborn state a fighting chance.
It's hard to believe that only 3 years after the Holocaust, Jews again faced annihilation. In 1948, 5 Western-equipped armies mobilized to invade the new Jewish state in Palestine. The Palestinian Jews had no weapons, no military planes, and no allies, not even the United States. Only a miracle or an ingenious plan could have saved them. There was nothing in Al Schwimmer's background to indicate that he would one day play a pivotal role in the reshaping of the Middle East. Al led a quiet private life before he led the clandestine 1948 operation to arm the besieged Palestinian Jews. No one would have imagined that he would become one of the FBI's most wanted men. This law-abiding first-generation American served honorably as a U.S. Air Transport Command flight engineer during World War II. He earned the trust of everyone around him, making lifelong friends across the globe. Besides, he shied away from conflict.
His war record is transporting this and that, not combat. Once in his entire World War II experience, the plane that he was flying was buzzed by German planes who just disappeared. They were probably low on fuel.
There was also nothing in Al's background to indicate that he would one day stick his neck out for his fellow Jews. He distanced himself so far from Judaism, his World War II buddies thought he was German. He observed no Jewish holidays and avoided political discussions about the future of the Jewish community in Palestine.
He had been in Tel Aviv a few times. No great connection. After the war, he was asked by his mother to see on one of his trips if he could find any traces of her family.
Al visited displaced persons camps in Hungary and France. He found out that most, if not all, of his extended family had perished during the Holocaust. He also learned that the 300,000 survivors of Hitler's final solution had nowhere to go.
Every country closed their gates to them, incidentally. There was great unrest by the Jews who lived in Palestine wanting their brethren to come in to rescue the Holocaust survivors. And so the British set up a blockade, a naval blockade, to limit the number of Jews coming in.
The British controlled Palestine from 1920 to 1948.
They realized that there are a lot more Arabs than there are Jews, and there are a lot more Muslims than there are Jews, and that the Arabs had oil and the Palestinian Jews had nothing.
These are only a few of the thousands who dashed themselves against the ironclad British blockade of the coast. Just north of Haifa, a blockade runner is beached after the 1,000 illegal immigrants had put up a savage battle against the naval boarding party. The immigrants are transferred to other vessels to await deportation to Cyprus.
They had one commission after another met of the United Nations after World War II to decide what to do with Palestine.
The resolution was adopted by 33 votes, 13 against, 10 abstentions.
The vote was to establish two states in Palestine, one Arab state and one Jewish state. And the Arab countries essentially said they weren't going to abide by it.
Feeling that they were being made to pay the price of a European atrocity, the Holocaust, Arab leaders had good reasons to reject the UN partition plan. Although the British had promised them all of Palestine, the UN offered only half, an insult considering Arabs made up 2/3 of Palestine's population.
The partition plan was voted by the UN on November the 29th, 1947. The British said they would get out on May the 15th. The Arabs were going to invade on May the 15th. The Jews knew they didn't have arms. They knew they had only 600,000 people. These Arab leaders were sort of vying for each other on who was going to get the spoils.
The Arab League vowed to conquer all of Palestine. Thus, hundreds of thousands of Palestinian Arabs left their homes, planning to return after the war.
If you were a Jew there, you figured that you probably weren't going to survive whatever happened.
As a child, Al struggled to survive. An accident left him with a permanent limp, and his family's abject poverty forced him to drop out of school at an early age. He had to become street smart and fast.
I was born in New York City, and I was raised in Connecticut in the middle of the Great Depression, and we just didn't hardly have enough to eat in the house.
A refugee family, Hungarian, who, like many refugee families at the time, struggled. Al's father was frustrated, not being able to get into the economy. He was also a proud Jew, although not a practicing Jew. He reacted at times violently to expressions of anti-Semitism. Al went the other way, became he would never fight.
I was with the U.S. military in Vermont, simply living and working around there as a kid in order that I wouldn't be a burden on my parents.
He always wanted to fly and always wanted to own an airline.
He would go by the airfield and eventually got a job there as a grease monkey and ended up just before the war at TWA as a flight engineer.
In his TWA duties, he had seen refugees in Europe and he wanted to do something. He had this idea of flying refugees into Palestine.
Somebody's at sea for 5-8 days. There's plenty of time to be found, but why not fly them over? Al's mind immediately started saying, okay, what can I do in order to help alleviate this situation? His mind works that way. It's not I'm appalled by what I see or I'm excited by what I see, but it is what can I now do?
So he went to the Jewish agency, which was then in New York at a place called the Hotel 14.
The Hotel 14 housed the North American offices of the Palestinian Jewish Underground, the Haganah. Its leader, David Ben-Gurion, set it up to raise funds and acquire weapons in the United States.
It was, of course, watched by the FBI. The entry to the Hotel 14 was the very famous Copacabana Club, where people like Frank Sinatra would appear. And the connections with the mafia proved themselves to be very useful. Frank Sinatra himself once took a stash of money on behalf of the Haganah and gave it to someone. So he went there. Now, the person at the counter, this formidable lady, said, well, come back next week and leave your details. And then they started checking him out. 1948, having a first name of Adolf was not terribly popular. Eventually, he got a hearing. He put forward his ideas. They were listened to, but again, it had to be checked out.
I don't know. I felt that it's doable and we've got to do it. We have no choice.
By that time, the main interest was no longer to get refugees from Europe into Palestine. What was of most concern was getting ready for the war.
The United Nations had declared a world embargo against sending arms to the Middle East. But the British continued to send arms to Egypt and Jordan.
It's quite clear to me why most countries refused to sell Israel any arms. The United States refused. First American president who agreed to negotiate with Israel on arms sales was Kennedy. Between 1948, when Israel was established, and 1962, nothing was sold to Israel.
In 1948, the U.S. government made a concerted effort to stop American citizens from sending military aid, including guns and ammunition, to the Jews in Palestine. The FBI, State Department, and Treasury Department confiscated several Israel-bound weapons shipments at the ports of New York, Miami, and other cities.
They didn't have weapons, but there were a large number of men here who had military experience. So they knew how to handle the weapons. We didn't have to train them, just had to bring them to them.
He convinces them that this he can do. There was something about him that exuded confidence. When he said something, you believed it. They said, okay, we'll give you some money.
The Haganah's U.S. operations chief, Yehuda Arazi, a master of disguises and covert affairs, told Al that they were scrambling to find an entity that would sell Israel weapons. But buying the weapons would be only half the battle. Your job, Arazi told Al, would be to get them to Israel. Al knew what he had to do. Race against the clock to buy and fix transport planes and prepare them for government inspections and transatlantic crossings, as well as build a team of trustworthy pilots and crews. As Al was leaving, Arazi asked him if he realized that he'd be breaking both U.S. and international laws, and that the FBI would tail him. Al said, "Now I know." The first thing Al did was call his friend and TWA colleague, Sam Lewis, with whom he flew during and after the Second World War.
Sam was a good pilot, a pilot's pilot, but more than that, he couldn't run something. But he could carry out any flying mission you would put him on, no matter how tough, and had the guts to do it.
That is the main reason why Al Schwimmer contacted me. Sam, we need pilots. We want you to train them. We want you to become involved wholeheartedly. They had the means to buy airplanes, of which there were many available through the War Surplus Agency.
They didn't need them anymore, and wherever they weren't prepared to fly them from Panama or someplace to the United States, so they put them up for sale.
He bought 3 Constellations for $15,000.
It looked like a Constellation, but it really wasn't. It was really junk.
Sam brought the first Connie in. We took it out that night. I was on it, Schwimmer was on it. As we break ground, Sam says to Schwimmer, "Well, Al, it flies."
Of course, there was the necessary subterfuge. We had to form what we called an airline.
Al, in order to get this thing started Schwimmer Airways.
He needed a strong manager to oversee the plane repair and preparation, so he called on his multi-talented World War II buddy, Ray Selk.
He came out with Al Schwimmer. They set up a base at Burbank Airport. They rented space. They got airplanes. They got parts. They got mechanics. They had people working there.
All the while knowing that this was illegal, which of course made the logistics much more difficult. Also made the recruitment of people more difficult.
Everybody who volunteered ran the risk of fines, imprisonment, and loss of citizenship. The attitude of the United States toward Israel today is totally different than the attitude in 1948. The American people were always friendly to Israel, but the State Department was hostile and was virtually an enemy, tried in every way possible to keep arms and volunteers from going to Israel.
The State Department aimed to build strong ties with the Arab world, which had the oil and the Suez Canal, and to appease England, a crucial partner in the escalating Cold War. The State Department went to great lengths to try to reverse the UN partition plan and abort the Jewish state.
The proposal of the United States government to suspend all efforts to implement the partition plan is a shocking reversal of its position. We are at an utter loss to understand the reason for this amazing reversal.
There was this whole communist thing in the background that was used by Britain largely to try to keep people from getting into Palestine. It was a total fiction. You know, like the Jewish refugees, the Holocaust survivors were communists.
Why did Truman do this? Truman was such a friend. They just assumed probably that the Jews were going to lose.
Created in the 1930s to keep Americans from getting involved in the growing global conflict, the Neutrality Act became dormant once the United States entered World War II in 1941. However, the U.S. government reactivated it in 1948 to keep Americans from getting involved in the Middle East conflict.
If they could prove that you volunteered to the Israeli army, that was good enough in 1948 to take your citizenship away from you. All of our passports were stamped that year, not valid for travel to a foreign country for purposes of serving in a foreign army.
We created a few different airlines in order to keep the authorities off our tail because they were after us.
But where do we get the pilots? How many pilots can you get that would do so-called illegal type of flying?
I get a phone call. I understand you're interested in flying. I said, no. Well, I have a paper here that says you are. Oh, well, it depends on for whom and for what. That's how I met the Al Schwimmer group.
An immigrant from Hungary, Lou flew in the Pacific as a U.S. Marine fighter pilot during World War II. Frustrated that he never got a chance to fight the Nazis, he spent his post-war years helping to create the Palestinian Jews Air Force, which consisted of a few ineffective Piper planes.
My page one in my family album is a picture of my grandmother, who at the age of 70 was shoved into the ovens of Auschwitz. When I had introduced Al, by the way, he was so modest. I'd say, I want you to meet the man that changed my life. And the life of many others, just mine and others' lives. And he'd always say, no, never mind.
Ike Eichel thought he was done with war after spending 3 years fighting the Nazis as a U.S. Air Force bomber pilot. But a chance post-war encounter with British pilots in Cairo changed his mind.
When I was transferred to Egypt from Europe, I met a few RAF pilots. They became friends, and they invited me to their officers' club for a few drinks. And we said, well, gee, they're talking about founding a state of Israel. He says, it'll never happen. They'll be attacked right away. I said, the Egyptians will attack. He says, and all the other Arab countries will attack it. And he says, they'll be using us. I said, how could you do that? We'll take a leave of absence, and we'll be technical advisors, but we'll be flying the airplanes.
Hearing this caused Ike to seek a way to help the Palestinian Jews. Through his aviation connections, he found out about Al's operation.
I was sworn into the Haganah, believe it or not.
In one of my trips to Germany, I met some first cousins that had survived the camps. They were bereft of water. To keep her small daughter alive, she had to feed her urine on her lips to relieve her some little bit. Now, with a cousin telling you this, there is no way I have to further justify to anybody for participating.
One of Alan Sam's most prized recruits was Marty Ribicoff, a highly skilled ATC pilot.
He just fell into things. He was looking for work, and he just happened to be in the right place at the right time. The people that Al Schwimmer worked with, somehow they got his name.
Alan Sam cast a wide net for pilots across America and beyond. They tapped into their military connections and called on old friends from around the globe. They found it challenging to recruit pilots who were reaping the social and economic benefits of the post-war boom.
The Canadian government went along with the British and the Americans, enforcing an embargo on arms to Palestine and not allowing their nationals to travel to that area. As a matter of fact, there was even some threat that anyone who would go and serve would lose their Canadian citizenship.
Bill had other reasons as well to turn Al down.
I thought I'd had enough of military. Close to 4 years I'd spent in the Canadian Air Force. And I'd set my ambition for medicine, and I'd spent between 1945 and 1948 preparing for this. Here I'd been accepted into medical school where competition for admission was extremely difficult at that time.
Bill joined Al's group anyway.
After what I'd heard about the Holocaust, heck, this is the least I could do.
Before long, we had a nucleus of about a dozen pilots.
They weren't all Jews. There were many who knew what I was doing, agreed to fly with us or for us, whatever you want to call it, because they knew me personally. We'd flown together in World War II.
Before he could join Al's team, radio operator Eddie Stierek first had to get out of a British prison in Palestine.
I was arrested for bringing in Jews from France. We were caught for aiding and abetting illegal immigration to the Holy Land. So we served 4.5 months in a British prison in Accra. I wasn't breaking the law, I was saving a people. I'm not Jewish. And I went there and I did it. I can't even talk to anybody about it because who the hell is going to believe it? And then they asked me, are you not a Jew? How do you explain that? I don't know, I can't explain it, I just did.
Eddie said, if you smuggle in some radio parts, I will build it and radio out the positions of the guards and what their schedules are, and when they're there, when they're not there, and where to place the bomb to blow a hole in the wall. So they knew which wall to blow and where the prisoners wouldn't get hurt, and they blew the hole in the wall and the prisoners escaped.
Eddie became Al's second radio operator. The first was Harold Livingston, an ATC radio operator during World War II.
After the war, I went to work right out of the Army for TWA, the airline. That's where I met Sam Lewis. That's where I met Schwimmer. I set up TWA's ground stations in Tripoli and in Cairo, and then I was in Dhahran, Saudi Arabia.
That's where Harold met Ike.
We get a call one day. You got to get a guy out of Saudi Arabia, out of Dhahran. He said he punched one of the Arab officials in the nose and they're going to cut off his hand or something. That was Livingston. I said, what'd you do? Why'd you punch the guy? He said something nasty about Jews.
Harold surprised himself with his violent reaction to the Saudis' anti-Semitic remark.
I was an American. Not a Jew, an American.
The reason Harold joined Al and Sam had little to do with his Jewish background.
It was the idea of getting back into action.
The planes that Al bought were 3 Constellations and 10 C-46s.
We paid $5,000 apiece for the C-46s. Otherwise, I had to leave them there and junk them.
He says, you just go down to the War Surplus Administration and buy a C-46. Okay, I followed instructions, went down there, showed them my discharge certificate. I gave them the $5,000, and they gave me a piece of paper that I own a C-46. And then Schwimmer's guys picked it up.
Sam Lewis took me in hand, and he actually taught me how to fly a C-46, a plane I'd never even been into before.
I get in the airplane, and Sam says, you never flew one? And Sam, I've never even seen one. Never mind, get in the right seat and I'll teach you on the way.
Sam could fly any plane, and believed that with a little training, his men could too.
Like Al Schwimmer, he was the guy with the airline background, so we all looked up to him. In spite of, he was a very vain guy, you know. He had to be strong, he had to be athletic, he was always working out with the weights. When he found out I was working out with weights, the first thing he said, let's do an arm wrestle. And I was starting to beat him, and he looked like he was going to panic, so I let him beat me.
Whenever he'd see me, no matter where we were, he'd challenge me to push-ups. I beat him only once. After that, I let him win all the time. You know, it's totally against the law. The FBI was looking for us all the time.
They came to our house, I remember, and they wanted to talk to him. I don't really think Ray or Al or the others were really scared about that.
But we stayed a step ahead of all the authorities all the time. They knew we were operating, tried to catch us, but couldn't. When they were there, we were here. When we were here, they were there. We were always not available.
Al and Sam moved half of their airplanes to Millville, New Jersey. At the Millville airport, Arazi told Al that Israel finally found a country willing to sell it weapons. Now it's all up to you, Arazi said. Czechoslovakia is landlocked in the middle of unfriendly Europe. These weapons will save no one unless you bring them to Israel.
The Czechs sold the Israelis $12 million worth of arms. They were really Nazi weapons. The Mausers was a German standard infantry rifle. If you look closely into the metal, you will see the German Eagle. They sold Israel 30,000 rifles, 10 or 15,000 machine guns, bullets, thousands and thousands of rounds, and 25 Messerschmitts.
The planes were surplus airplanes that were made in Czechoslovakia during the Second World War. And there was a lot of that stuff still lying around. So the Jews bought it, and they trained pilots.
One of the fighter pilots was Gideon Lichtman, who flew for the U.S. Air Force in the Pacific during World War II.
I was going to NYU at the time, putting little numbers and little squares in a bookkeeping class there. I said, what am I doing here when I could possibly be helping out the Jews in Israel? I get a mimeographed form. I put down there I was a fighter pilot. I started getting telegrams and phone calls and everything, and it was like in the movies.
Switching back to his natural role of a fighter pilot after helping Al out with the transport planes, Lou joined a few other Americans on their journey to Czechoslovakia. Landing behind the Iron Curtain at the start of the Cold War, the fighter pilots were already on edge before they saw that they would be training at a former Nazi airbase on Nazi planes.
They gave us beautiful flight jackets and gloves. I put it on, looked down there. There's a Luftwaffe wings on it. Took it off, very carefully took off the wings.
On the territory of this airbase, the first conversion course was commenced in first day of May 48, and the first group of pilots were consist of several Israeli pilots and several English-speaking pilots from South Africa and from USA also.
Okay, I'm sitting in this airplane now. Ordinarily, you have a runway. Here, it's just a great big grass field. Nothing.
Lou and the other pilots quickly discovered that lack of a proper runway was the least of their concerns. The Messerschmitts that the Czechs sold Israel were death traps. They had an Me-109 frame, but little else in common with the workhorse German fighter plane.
The warehouse with all the motors burned down.
It had an underpowered engine.
It didn't have a rudder trim. To put the flaps down, you had a little wheel about that size that you had to crank. So you never get to put the flaps down.
It was underpowered, nose heavy, and not too stable in landing, but it was better than nothing. They wouldn't let military planes out, but this prohibition didn't go for transports. But every time the State Department got wind that any plane was going to go to Israel, they tried to find some other reason. So what they did is they imposed a law on weight.
We had no export license from the States. We had to have a way to fly from the States to Europe with airplanes, parts, engines.
Well, Schwimmer knew or was friendly with this man named Marty Belfon, who had been a major in the United States Army Air Force. Belfon was married to the niece of the then president of Panama. And Schwimmer sweet-talked him into coming in with us.
Panama didn't have an airline, and so they said, here, we can give you an airline. We've got an airline. We will start an airline for you. We've got these planes.
So they transferred the 13 airplanes into Panamanian registry, and it became Líneas Aéreas de Panamá, which was the national airline of Panama with the Panamanian flag.
They went to the extent of printing a brochure. They opened up LAPSA offices.
Sam quickly secured a Panamanian registry number for his favorite, Connie, and flew it to Panama's brand new international airport. He swiftly returned to the U.S. to help Al sneak out the C-46s.
We overloaded the C-46s to the maximum capacity and beyond even. If we had had an engine failure on one of the C-46s, they wouldn't be able to make it.
After our training in the C-46, both in California and New Jersey, we got the word we got to go to Panama, get the airplanes painted up and get our license number from the Panama government.
They were going to then take these planes out to Panama, and the State Department still tried to keep them from doing it.
Customs agent tried to hold us up, prevent us from flying.
They actually blocked the runway.
Al's men figured this was their last chance.
They just said, we're going to run over these cars that are in the runway.
You want to stop us, you'll have to shoot us down. And we went to Panama.
We had 6 C-46s in Millville, New Jersey, and 4 in Lockheed Burbank Airport. The California group went from Burbank to Mexico City to Panama. We went from Millville, New Jersey to Jamaica, Kingston, Jamaica, Panama.
They were received with great fanfare. The president of Panama was there.
The pilots and crew, however, were not in a festive mood. Their overloaded planes had claimed the lives of 2 pilots, 2 friends, in Mexico City.
Mexico City had a very long runway, about 11,000 feet, but it was a very high field elevation. And if you were very heavy and overloaded, your takeoff roll was excessive. Sam Lewis got off by the skin of his teeth, My dad followed in the second airplane. He barely got off also. And Bill Gershon, with King as his co-pilot, were the third to take off.
Just as he cleared the runway, Bill Gerson lost an engine.
What Gerson did was he lost the engine and he dumped the flaps to get gain out. And that's a very tricky maneuver, and it didn't work.
The plane crashed. Bill and Glenn King died.
My father sort of instituted a pilot's rebellion, if you want to call it that I think Schwimmer wasn't too happy about.
Schwimmer, having been blamed for Gerson's death because he overloaded the airplane, comes down with Harman Shamir. Schwimmer sat there in this, as I say, this commanding presence with all of us there, but there must have been 20 guys in this room in Panama, and he said, if I'm a murderer, then I did it. I okayed that weight. I flew that airplane myself.
They all had to be overloaded because they couldn't leave the equipment there. It would have been confiscated.
Schwimmer calmed everybody down. Then Shamir got up and he gave this speech, how they're fighting in Israel and they're dying, and without you, he said, we have nothing. We're gone. And before he was done, I'd have thrown myself out the window if he'd asked me to.
Their confidence restored, the aviators waited in Panama for Al's green light.
Until they could figure out some of the logistics of getting them out of Panama and into Europe and the Middle East.
To make it legitimate, we're flying cattle from one place to another.
We needed some licenses, radio licenses for the airplane. I go to the Panamanian Transport Commission, I don't know who, and he said, well, I deal in ships. I said, well, now you're dealing in airplanes. So he had to go out. I'm thinking, I'm in some kind of trouble here because he's going to go out, he's going to find out, he's going to check around, and he'll see that this is a scam. But he comes back, gives me these 10 documents. I get out of there fast. Then one day, we told him we're making a route survey flight, and all the airplanes take off and they go. Never came back.
We fitted the aircraft up in ferry tanks and extra drums of gasoline to give us the legs to get across the South Atlantic.
We couldn't go the northern route. The United States wouldn't let us.
When we got the signal, we took off from Panama to Paramaribo, Dutch Guiana, all 9 of us, and flew to Natal, Brazil.
We get some cooperation from British South American Airways. And they don't know who we are. They think we're legitimate. So we use their radio facilities.
The U.S. State Department inadvertently did Al a big favor. The Panamanian cover would help shield his men on every leg of their turbulent voyage.
2 by 2s they left, the C-46s.
Across the ocean to Dakar, Africa, to Casablanca, Morocco. When we landed in Casablanca, at the airport there were some demonstrations. There were guys marching back and forth, placard, down with Israel, kill the Jews. So we were going into town, so he said, we'd like to hire somebody to guard the airplanes. The airport manager said, well, what about those guys? I said, are they trustworthy? He says, yeah, they work here. So we hired the anti-Israelis to guard the Israeli airplanes. From Casablanca to Catania, Sicily.
Meanwhile, Harold's C-46 remained in Brazil for repairs.
We went to lunch one day with our friends, the British South American, the BSA guys, and he showed us a newspaper clipping that 2 airplanes carrying Panamanian registry have been impounded in Catania, Sicily. He said, that wouldn't be your airplanes. They cut us off. We left that night, thankfully.
Using their Hotel 14 mafia connections, as well as good old-fashioned bribes, Al and Shamir sought to free the 2 impounded planes in Sicily. While they waited, Ike and Eddie went into town.
The next thing I know, there's a big tall guy leaning over us.
The gentleman who confronted Ike and Eddie was a representative of the notorious mafia boss, Lucky Luciano.
Says, you guys got me worried. I said, What do you mean? I'm just happening to be. He says, no, you don't understand. We don't know where you come. We don't know where you go. I said, Eddie, let's tell him. And we explained to him what we were doing there. Oh, man, no, Jimmy, I didn't know. Why didn't you say so in the first place? Hey, anything I could do for you guys? I said, well, we could use some Thompson submachine guns. The next day, I get back to my room, and it's a big box. And it's a case full of brand new in Cosmoline Thompson submachine guns.
That afternoon, Ike, Eddie, and their teammates flew the two planes out of Sicily and entered Russian-run Eastern Europe.
We took off from Sicily, went to Brno, Czechoslovakia.
And then we went to Žatec, Zebra.
We had code names. Zatek was Zebra, Ajaccio was Jockstrap.
Tel Aviv was Tulsa. Israel was Oklahoma. The United States was Detroit. South America was Latin Detroit. Al was Irvin Johnson. The Connie was Cadillac. The C-46 was Dodge. The Messerschmitt was Knife.
Messerschmitts couldn't reach Palestine on a direct flight from Czechoslovakia. They didn't have the range. They had to be flown there. Al brought over these big transport planes, but the Messerschmitt didn't fit. So the Messerschmitt had to be taken apart.
We put the wings in one C-46 and the fuselage with the engine and everything in another C-46.
They hustled to load the other C-46s with rifles and ammunition.
I had everything inspected before we took it on board, and if a rifle didn't work or something, we left it.
Al ordered his men to land in Israel just after British rule ended.
The C-46 couldn't make it all the way to Israel. We had to stop at Ajaccio, Corsica to refuel.
We remained in Corsica for a few hours. Of course, there was a dismantled Messerschmitt fighter on the plane.
We figured out how long it would take us from Ajaccio to Akir in Israel. And we estimated the time to be that we would arrive on or about midnight, May 15th. The first wave got there about 10 minutes after midnight.
First thing I remember was the scent of orange blossoms, or the citrus scent. And it was a nice balmy night. And this guy says, in the Jeep, he says, "Shalom." I said, "Shalom." I said, "Shalom." He said, "You're American." I said, "Yes, American."
The Israelis wasted no time unloading the weapons or putting them to use.
They took them off before we shut the engines down.
It was a feeling of having accomplished something for once in my life.
After the plane was unloaded, another crew would be waiting, and the plane refueled and go back to Czechoslovakia by way of Corsica.
The weapons Al brought helped the Israelis ward off the Arab onslaught. For now.
The Egyptian Air Force had this command of the skies. They have 50 brand new Spitfires that the beautiful British government gave them. They were over Tel Aviv dropping their bombs. They dropped the bombs and then come down at rooftop level and machine gun, back and forth.
Al realized that fighting 5 armies on 4 fronts, the Israelis could only hold on for so long. So he flew back to the States, knowing he could be jailed at any moment, to try to buy and smuggle out bombers.
They had a warrant out for my arrest. The FBI. You ever heard of them?
Al outfoxed the FBI to purchase a B-17 bomber from the Air Force, on the condition that he would turn it into scrap metal. Back in Czechoslovakia training on the Messerschmitts, Lou devised a dramatic plan of his own. Used the element of surprise to destroy the Egyptian fighter planes and bombers on the ground.
I said, well, I think the only chance that we have is to hit El Arish where they're coming from.
Under the protection of its Air Force, an Egyptian army division of more than 10,000 troops advanced on Israel's economic and political center, Tel Aviv. Al's men continued flying in the surplus Nazi weapons and planes In the States, Al bought 2 B-17 bombers from Miami businessman Charlie Winters. Meanwhile, the Egyptian Army Division continued its march toward Tel Aviv. Syria cut a swath through northern Israel, and Jordan conquered the old city of Jerusalem.
It was no time. So we went to the Czech commander's office, and I said, we have to leave. He said, how could you do that? He says, you did the firing, you didn't drop bombs, you didn't do formation flying. I says, we have no alternative. We can't just sit here with flyable airplanes while Israel gets bombed daily with not even an anti-aircraft gun.
Lou felt that besides himself, 3 other fighter pilots were ready. 2 Israelis,
Modi Alon, Azer,
and 1 South African,
Eddie Cohn. So we came back in Schwimmer's C-46s.
Lou hopped aboard the C-46, captained by his new lifelong friend, Kali Goldstein, an ATC veteran.
He's worried about the fuel, he's worried about this and about, we only had one map, Automobile Club of Europe map. It wasn't an aerial map at all. And now suddenly he sees me jump out and grab a bunch of wildflowers. I was going to give it to the first woman I see. Dumb.
As soon as he disembarked the C-46 in Akir, Lou handed the wildflowers to a young Israeli soldier.
About 10 years later, I'm in New York. I hear a voice that says, Captain Lenart, you remember me? I'm the girl you gave the flower to when you landed in Tel Aviv.
Back in the U.S., Al wanted to get his hands on that first B-17 he had purchased. But after taking his money, the Air Force denied him access to the bomber. For Al, this was a mere inconvenience.
It was on a military field, but we bought it, we owned it. We're supposed to scrap it.
Al decided to get the plane out.
We had a friend that worked at that airfield. He was a mechanic and he got the airplane prepared for us. We gave him money and he paid to have them put gas in it there.
Along with one of his pilots, Leo Gardner, Al flew to the grounded B-17 location, Tulsa, the real one, in the real Oklahoma.
Neither one of us had ever flown a B-17.
As they drove up in uniform, the fellow who was standing at the gate said, you're going to the party. So they said, oh yeah, well, he said, well, it's over there.
We got in there and we found the switches with flashlights and so forth. We didn't want to turn any lights on. Started up, the 2 of us taxied it out. The tower, we heard him, don't take off now, please identify yourself. We went off.
In Israel, Lou and 3 of the other fighter pilots prepared to take off on the Messerschmitts, which had finally been reassembled. They prepared to carry out Lou's plan using the element of surprise to destroy the Egyptian Spitfires on the ground.
Bombs were hung because the next dawn I would be flying to El Arish.
At the last moment, everything changed.
A jeep roars up and he says, listen, the whole Egyptian army is 6 miles from the airbase here. If we don't stop them tonight, they'll be in Tel Aviv tomorrow morning and the war is over. We're finished. All 4 started, zip, 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 4 started. I went to the runway and I took off.
Ike watched the Messerschmitts from the Givat Brenner kibbutz, which sits on top of a hill.
And 4 Israeli Messerschmitts fly over. This is the first time they've flown.
The kibbutz members assumed they were enemy planes.
The guys were starting to shoot at them with the Mausers we brought in from Czechoslovakia. I said, hey, stop, this is ours.
I knew that the target was in the south, but I didn't know precisely where in the south. I was only there a couple of days. I'm looking down at him, and he figured out that I didn't quite know where, and he just went like this. I straightened the airplane out. He was on my wing, and I saw the whole Egyptian army as far as I could see.
And they came down in single file, did a bombing run on the first pass, which completely took the Egyptians by surprise.
I turned the airplane upside down because when you dive bomb, the more you get to a 90-degree angle, the better your aim is.
By the time they came around for the strafing run, it was just full of anti-aircraft flak. Came around and made a third pass. The number 4 guy on the end got shot down.
That night, the intelligence people intercepted a message that said, "We are heavily attacked by enemy aircraft and we are scattering." They never moved 1 inch forward.
The aerial attack saved Israel and turned the war around. Al's operation gave rise to an Israeli air force that lost no dogfights, chased away Egyptian and Syrian fighter planes and bombers, gained control of the skies, and allowed the Israeli troops to protect their new homeland.
The Egyptians and Syrians, they were expecting to fly over and not face any opposition, and here these fighter planes were climbing up to try to shoot them down. They ended up shooting down either 16 or 17 planes. The first person to shoot down a fighter plane, an Arab fighter plane, is totally unknown. If you mention Gideon Lichtman to an Israeli, they wouldn't know who he was at all.
The plain fact is that if it wasn't for us, it would not be in Israel today.
To assure Israel's long-term survival, Al gathered his men in Miami to smuggle out the 3 B-17s he had bought.
We took off one after the other. Miami to San Juan. We had a navigator who was basically navigating by the stars to get us to first in the Azores for refueling. And then we landed in Czechoslovakia.
The B-17s were totally stripped down, so they reinstalled bomb racks. When they took off from Czechoslovakia, they would bomb Arab targets on their way to Israel. They aimed for the king's palace. It was King Farouk, but they missed the target, and then they bombed Gaza. And then they came into Akir, reloaded, and went on to Damascus and dropped bombs on Damascus. They weren't really looking to destroy cities and whatnot like in World War II. What we were doing is sending a message that we could reach you too.
As the Czech airlift neared its conclusion, Al started using the C-46s as bombers too. Al's men played a pivotal role throughout the war, helping Israel score a shocking victory. The victory came at a steep price. 6,000 Jews and about 12,000 Arabs died. More than 700,000 Palestinian Arabs fled or were expelled from their homes. In their quest to save the newborn Jewish state, 8 of Al's men lost their lives. Al's men helped create a new commercial airline. Unlike LAPSA, the Panamanian Front, this one was real. El Al. Lou became an El Al captain. Sam became the airline's chief pilot. However, Al, Ike, Eddie, and most of the rest of the group decided to move back to the States, knowing that they could face lengthy prison sentences.
The United States Secretary of State put an order out to arrest us, but they were never able to catch up to us. Until in the end, when we went ahead and gave ourselves up, when it was over.
Al and Sam, along with their top mechanics Ray Selk and William Sasnow, as well as Leo Gardner, who helped Al take possession of the B-17, spent 2 nights in a Los Angeles jail.
The legal department of the U.S. government were asking for a 7 or 8 year sentence for me for what I did.
They'd talk about the fellows being at the Hotel Stalingrad in Czechoslovakia and tried to make it look like they were communists or whatnot, you know, anything that they could throw around.
Things looked grim for Al, Sam, and the other defendants, but they had a secret weapon, and they didn't even know it. It was delivered accidentally by an Israeli Air Force friend, an ex-intelligence officer who was studying at UCLA.
So I go down to the courthouse, and they're in the process of impaneling a jury.
And I see the next prospective juror is the fellow from my speech class at UCLA who gave a very strong pro-Israel speech. So I called the attorney over and I told him about this guy, and they got him on the jury. He hung the jury. So instead of jail sentences, the deal made was that there would be only fines.
So the sentencing came down and they were convicted felons and they had a $10,000 fine each to pay, which the Jewish agency took care of. But what it meant was once you're a felon, you can't vote, you can't carry a firearm, you can't do all these other things. So that left a bit of a mar on our silk anyhow. The only time somebody went to jail was Charlie Winters, who was a non-Jew, who got stuck in Florida.
Charlie Winters spent 18 months in prison for selling Al 2 B-17s.
I was the only one of the 10 that was found by the jury to be not guilty. One woman juror who claims that I was really the only professional pilot, an ex-captain of TWA, and I was not part of the conspiracy.
I lost my rights, my civil law rights in the United States. But I could only get them back if I made a special appeal to the government and this and that. And I had to say I did the wrong thing and I admit I'm guilty. I refused to say all that.
50 years after his conviction, Al had a chance to win back his civil rights without having to say he was wrong.
I had a good friend who was a good friend of Clinton's, and he introduced me to Clinton. Clinton said, okay, got all my civil rights back. Better than going to jail.
Al and his men built the foundation for what would become one of the world's finest air forces.
Everybody wanted it to be successful. Nobody was ready to accept that it's gonna fail. And with that kind of an attitude and approach on the part of all the people involved, it had to succeed, and it did.
What would they have done? Without us and without Schwimmer, they wouldn't have anything.
I don't feel like being an American hero or an Israeli hero. What for? Too many people that gave everything they had to give. Well, I'm supposed to stand out there and it doesn't fit me.
My experience in Israel was by far the greatest experience I ever had in my life. And it's not only with me. Every guy, I'm talking about non-Jews and Jews, every one of us said the same thing. There was never any more meaningful or any more satisfying experience. In fact, the rest of my life is a drag compared to that. Not really, dear.
Funding for A Wing and a Prayer was made possible by